Hi everybody, welcome back to my YouTube page, and welcome if you're new here. My name is Eric, and today we are going to be talking about whether or not Jesus would approve of divorce in the case of physical abuse. Now, one of the things that inspired this video in the first place is a little while ago I did a few video responses to an atheist by the name of Christy Burke. And in one of her videos, where she points out times where Jesus wasn't all love and peace, she objects to Jesus' teaching on divorce, believing that in the case of physical abuse, Jesus would not permit a divorce. And I intend to show why that is not the case. Now, sadly, this is not a monolithic view in the church, but nevertheless, I will show why. At least there are a couple ways, biblically, to come to the conclusion that, yes, the Bible does in fact allow for a divorce in the case of physical abuse. Now, in order to understand my argument as to why I believe this, we have to keep in mind the circumstances in which the Bible does explicitly state that divorce can happen. Number one, as we said, it is explicitly stated to be permitted in the case of sexual immorality. And in 1 Corinthians 7, abandonment is also grounds for divorce. It is at least permitted. Paul said that if your spouse leaves, then you don't have any obligation in that case. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, in the verse that I'm going to show here, it specifically says that if you are persecuted in one town, flee to another. So they are commanded to flee in the case of circumstances where danger is upon them and physical harm could be brought upon people. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that nobody will ever die for the gospel. In fact, in some cases in this very chapter, Jesus will say that, yes, one day you will be brought before the governors and everything else, and in that case you will be forced to choose between Christ and your life. But that ends and is most likely due to circumstances where they couldn't avoid it, and there was no escape route. But when there is an escape route, we see even in the book of Acts, all the time, that the believers flee from persecution all over the place. That's the norm. Now, let's think about this for a second. If he allows us to flee from danger with something as important as preaching the gospel, why wouldn't he command it in a much lower stakes case, such as a marriage? I mean, I don't think any Christian would ever say that marriage is more important than the gospel. Because if you leave and don't preach anymore, well then somebody may not hear the gospel that you did, but yet the Lord still, despite that possibility, still says, no, you need to leave that place if you can. So that really doesn't make much sense if he would command it in one instance, but wouldn't in a much lesser stakes scenario, where you're equally in danger. Now, here's the thing. The fact is that if you are commanded to run in the case of being physically in danger, if we are commanded to do that, then the abusive spouse is responsible for causing a distance between the person and themselves. So, if that is the case, that they are creating a distance which is forced, then in essence they are forcing a situation where you are away from the person. And if that is the case, then that would meet the criteria for what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 as you're essentially forcing them to stay away as long as you're abusive. And that would fit the criteria of 1 Corinthians 7, where abandonment is, in fact, grounds for divorce, and it is permitted. Now, the next way that we know that Jesus would have approved of divorce in this circumstance is we can see how he applied commandments. We can see that Jesus routinely had priorities. He prioritized certain commandments above others. In fact, we can see his, for lack of a better term, hierarchy in the Gospel of Matthew when he says the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, the first commandment, nobody has ever done that perfectly. And really, the only way you can ever do that is the gospel, by trusting in Christ and him imputing your righteousness, and then eventually when you get to heaven, your sin nature will be taken away, and then you will be able to fulfill it. That's the only way you can, which is the reason why it's so important. However, the second commandment, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, was routinely prioritized over other commandments, even the Sabbath. Jesus healed on the Sabbath and did what others would consider works on the Sabbath. Jesus simply said that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. In fact, he pointed out that the Pharisees routinely, if they had a sheep that was, fell into a hole, that they would pick it out on the Sabbath. And he didn't criticize them for that. In fact, he criticized them for not taking the whole rule far enough. You see, in his whole hierarchy, for lack of better terms, of commandments, he said the first greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second was to love your neighbor as you love yourself. The other commandments were subordinate, for lack of a better term, to those. Think about it this way. In Nazi Germany, people lied to the government if they were hiding Jews. Were they doing something wrong by doing that? Well, no, not really. They weren't. They were basically preserving life, because the imperative to preserve somebody's life from unjust oppression was more important than telling the truth. So it wasn't so much that lying was just not a big deal. It was more so that there is a priority of which commands or which moral imperatives, which is more important. Now, in the same way, Jesus considered the command, love your neighbor as you love yourself, to be more important than the command to honor the Sabbath. So we have to consider that Jesus typically employed the principles of loving your neighbor as you love yourself and doing good to others were more important than other commandments, such as the Sabbath. Now, we have to then ask ourselves, could something similar be present for divorce? We have to consider a few facts about this entire question. Number one, marriage is considered a picture of Christ and the church, their relationship. It's supposed to represent that. And it's important, and it's a very significant, deep spiritual truth. However, we also need to keep in mind that the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, also says that the Sabbath is a type of heaven itself, and also the gospel. And we can see this in this passage here, Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declare on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And just for context, the people who didn't obey were the people who complained in the wilderness during the book of Exodus to Moses. And picking up in the next verse, and yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world, God's. For somewhere, he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for anyone who enters God's rest and also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. Let's consider the fact that the Sabbath, although it was clearly a foreshadowing of something very significant, like the gospel, which is, again, very important, it was subordinate to the command to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, as important as marriage is nevertheless a shadow, a type. It is not the actual substance of God's relationship with his church. It is not the actual substance. So following the pattern of basically love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is primarily fulfilled by accepting the gospel and trusting in it, and then love your neighbor as you love yourself, and then the Sabbath, well, it's more likely that marriage is likely on par, again, with the Sabbath. So it's not that it isn't important, it's just simply the fact that it does subordinate to love your neighbor as you love yourself, which can include alleviating physical harm. Now, I'm not saying to take your marriage lightly. Again, if there isn't physical abuse and they just annoy you or something like that, then yeah, divorcing them would be a sin. But again, being legalistic to the point of just forcing an abused person to stay with their abuser is not something Jesus would have endorsed. Certainly not if the way he applied the Sabbath command is any indication. Now, even if you disagree with me and think that you shouldn't divorce somebody, there is something that I would encourage you to do. Even if you don't believe that the Bible would endorse a divorce per se, the Bible never says that husbands and wives have to live under the same house at all costs in all circumstances. So if you can't encourage a divorce, finally, spiritually or legally, fine. At the very least, we need to at least agree, and we should agree, that getting the person away, the abused person away, and living away from their abuser, even at the very least temporarily, until they get their life sorted out. That has to be mandatory. And if they never get their life sorted out, then, then they never have to go back. They don't have to live together. At the very least, we should at least be emphatic and absolutely clear that the person can leave the situation. They don't have to be in the same house with their abuser. Certainly not, most certainly not, if they haven't yet repented of their abusive ways. So I know this topic was a bit heavier than usual than many other topics, but I do think it's nevertheless an important one. Because again, this is something that deeply affects people's lives, and I wanted to give all of the knowledge and all of my answers as to, why I feel the way I do. So thank you very much, and comment down below if you disagree or why, and God bless you.